My name's Tim Cole. I'm a professor of social history at the University of Bristol, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this conversation around a brilliant new book written by Todd and colleagues, Ethics of the Algorithm. I feel a little odd as someone who's an outsider welcoming you here to a place that is familiar to you, to this book talk sponsored by the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, and thanks also to the co-sponsorship by the UCLA Program in Digital Humanities and the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies. What we're going to do is, in a moment, I'm going to invite Todd and Anna and Rachel to talk through the book project and introduce those of you who haven't read it to some of the visuals and the thinking behind the book. And then what I'll do is I'll offer a very brief response, and then maybe start off by asking the three of them a few questions that have emerged from my own reading, and then I'll open up to the whole audience for questions from everyone else. Before they do, I should just briefly introduce our three authors, co-authors. And one thing that actually really struck me when I read the book was right at the beginning. Todd talks about how he toggles in pronoun use between I and we in this book. And there's certain parts of the book where you zoom into sections where different authors are named. And I think that's characteristic of not just this project, but wider digital humanities work, which really brings a kind of lab model to play within the humanities. And I think this book is a real exemplar of that. And so it's great that this isn't just Todd here, much as I love Todd, but it's Todd, Anna and Rachel, who are all here talking about a project that in a sense the three of them represent, but there's others who could be at the table as well, who I'm sure they'll refer to, a project that emerges out of a lab that Todd has led. Todd, as many of you know, Todd Presner is Professor of European Languages and Transcultural Studies here at UCLA, where he holds the Michael and Irene Ross Chair in the Division of Humanities. Todd's written many books. Maybe I could just pick out two that have been particularly important for myself and my own work. One, Mobile Modernity, Germans, Jews and Trains. And I think questions of movement and of identity and of modernity in particular are very much at the heart of a lot of Todd's work. And you'll get a sense of that as well coming through, I think, in some of the things that we talk about a little bit today. I think another project that I've always been incredibly impressed with, which led to a co-authored book, was primarily a digital project that involved Todd's teaching, was Hypercities. So a way of thinking about how to map urban space in new ways. The book was called Digital Humanities, Hypercities, and I think interestingly thick mapping in the digital humanities. So an idea of kind of thick mapping has really been a core part of Todd's earlier work, and I think some of that will be a resonance in what Todd talks about today. And next to Todd is Anna Benazzi, who's a PhD candidate here at UCLA in the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. She's almost done with the PhD, so in that final stage that many of us know of writing up, working on digital archives of Holocaust testimonies, but alongside testimonies recorded by others, including refugees and migrant interviews, and in particular thinking about multiple languages and multilingual interviews. And then just next to Anna is Rachel Deblinger, who's also at UCLA. Rachel is the director of the Modern Endangered Archives program at the UCLA Library. Has a background in research within Holocaust and post-Holocaust studies, and is the author of a book that comes out in a couple of months' time. So if you have a birthday from May onwards, you're in luck this year, because the book that you can put on your wish list is a new book by Rachel called Saving Our Survivors, How American Jews Learned About the Holocaust, which thinks in particular about the institutions, the US institutions that were engaged in helping displaced persons, Holocaust survivors within Europe in the really interesting post-45 periods right at the end of the war. So I think we'll go in that order. I think Todd and then Anna and Rachel. And I'll invite them to talk about the project, and then maybe I'll just hop back up and just give a few reflections from my own reading of the book, ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open up to the rest of the audience. So Todd, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's so really a delight to see so many friends and colleagues here. And this is truly, it's different than a celebration. I think it's really just kind of marking a collaboration and trying to bring it into conversation with the broader community. And so I'm really delighted that Anna and Rachel and Tim were able to join me. I'm going to give a brief overview of the book. It's going to be about 12 minutes or so, and just try to kind of frame some of the larger issues, and then we'll delve into some of the specifics, and then open up, to questions. So one of the things that's maybe unique about this book, but maybe not as unique about some of the work that's happening in the digital humanities, is that collaborative dimension, and I'd say the experimental dimension. A lot of the methods that we were developing in this book were experiments. That is to say, we tried things out. Some things worked, some things didn't. And I would want to flag not only Anna and Rachel, but also Li Tzu Fan, Michelle Lee, Kyle Rosen, and Campbell Yomane, all of whom were variously in various programs of digital humanities, especially as undergraduates even, and are now co-authors in the book and contributed methods, visualizations, and research. The basic idea is really a question of how we can use computational methods in responsible ways, especially when we're doing historical research. And the historical research here is really about the Holocaust and large, really very large archives, digital archives of Holocaust testimony that, because they're so large, exceed the ability for a single human to comprehend them all. And so computational tools could be used to help us appreciate, discover new things, but how do we do so in responsible, ethical ways? And really, this is kind of what I mean by an ethics of the algorithm. It's really a description of what we could do with algorithmic or computational methods that raise both ethical questions and epistemological questions. Not so much that ethics adheres in an algorithm, but that it raises ethical questions that we have to confront. And these are largely around decision-making and attention. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. One other thing about the book that's kind of also maybe unique is it's an augmented book. You can read it with your phone. And it has QR codes throughout it, and they take you to visualizations, they take you to code, they take you to testimonies. Obviously, books are silent, but when you have your phone, you can hear voices. And I thought that was really important in the digital humanities because voice is a really a leitmotif that runs throughout the book. And that's my son's hand, by the way. He hasn't actually probably done much exploration of the book, but he lent me his hand. Well, where a lot of the digital material resides is actually on this website developed partly by Anna, Holocaust Research Lab. You can read all the digital material is available there, and the documentation that we did. And we currently kind of have a new instantiation of the lab focused around issues in AI and historical scholarship. The basic idea of the book is kind of, I guess, summarized maybe in this sentence. We live in a very different age than the Holocaust, obviously, or even most Holocaust survivors. Ours is characterized by big data, new technologies, AI, and this form of witnessing that we call in the book distant witnessing. And it's basically a recession from the events. We're geographically, temporally, linguistically far away from them, and yet there's this strange thing where we can call up all this information instantaneously. Right? It's this paradox that we're in. We're a surfeit of information and knowledge. You can Google anything and get anything, and yet we're also farther and farther away from the event. And so we have to figure out what these forms of mediation allow us, what kind of access they allow us, or what kind of things they allow. So it's really a humanities argument, like thinking about how computational methods can be used to preserve, interpret, perpetuate cultural memory, and it's largely around this issue of attentiveness, because we as readers, we might attend to certain things. We say we underline things in a text, right, when we read it, or highlight things. And you might ask, what does a computer attend to? What does it find? What does it highlight, right? What does it draw our attention to? And of course, there's a whole question of algorithmic decision-making there, which may be guided by humans who program those algorithms to operate in certain ways. They can also do all kinds of problematic things, as we know. But the question for me is, can they do things that are useful and humanizing, especially when you are dealing with sensitive issues like the Holocaust? So, things that you might think that algorithms do, well, they arrange, they create, they transform data. And how do they do it? Some of these ways. They count things, right? Algorithms sort, they filter, they rank, they predict, they cluster, they render, they score, they optimize, they decide. And we also know that they do things that are pretty negative, like they profile and surveil and even police. Right? We know recommendation algorithms, right, create filter bubbles. We know that algorithms are optimized to do lots of things. Traffic directions, how could they be used to enhance our knowledge of an archive, right? And this is a very different thing than using them for profiling or policing. But we have to know that algorithms are always dialectical. Like any technology, it can do certain things that I think we might want to hold up, and they can do things that are very problematic. So for our book, it's really about algorithms have agency. They have a very particular kind of agency to decide. and they can be used to expand our thinking as humanists, but they have epistemological, what we call epistemological and ethical consequence. That is how we know, and also what we should or shouldn't do, and even how we make judgments about the value of certain things. So in their application and in their function, algorithms raise these kind of questions. So the book is kind of structured as a series of kind of meditations. It kind of is a little bit genre defining in some ways, that it's about algorithms and ethics on the one hand, and especially in the contemporary, but it locates some of these questions historically in the 1930s, where algorithmic forms of collecting data were used in very nefarious ways to count people, to do biostatistics of populations, to optimize roundups of Jews. And so we start with computation that dehumanizes in order to imagine forms of computation that can be humanizing. And we have to see them side by side, because I think it's a potentiality of computation all the time, that a dehumanizing potentiality is always there. We move to really a founding figure, in the book at least, of a guy named David Boder, who is more than just a guy. He ended up being a professor at UCLA of psychology in his final years, but he's the first person that recorded testimonies of survivors in 1946 in their own voices in displaced persons camps. And an extraordinary body of material. And in many ways, he was also, because of his background in psychology, he was also interested in using kind of computational methods to understand this large archive. And so the book is located in this kind of nexus moment of technologies that were used for nefarious ends and the beginning of testimony as archive creating in the 1940s, 1946 to 55 or so. Throughout the book, we kind of move over a number of different archives, including the USC Shoah Foundation archive. We talk about the relevance of voice, particularly not just relying on transcripts, but orality, which is an important part, paralinguistic features of testimonies. We look at what survivors were asked, like the history of questions. In fact, close to 100,000 questions asked over time to different survivors in different archives, thinking, that's going to really impact, what people say, the kind of questions. I'm using computational tools to investigate those things. And and the book kind of ends with kind of like contemporary reflections on new media, AI, and possibilities for testimony in the contemporary. I mentioned just briefly kind of our current moment, and I think, I just wanted to kind of just provide some framing, is that this distant witnessing that we have here is very different than maybe the witnessing that I was involved with in the history of interviewing Holocaust survivors in a program I run at UCLA with Hillel called Bearing Witness. This is where students talk to Holocaust survivors, and in the middle there is during COVID. We did it over Zoom. Andrew actually is one of the photographers, and David Wu here. All the survivors that are here are no longer with us, but their stories are carried on in various ways. And one of the ways they're carried on is through interfaces like this. The USC Shoah Foundation's digital archive at the top, a project called Dimensions in Testimony, where you have actually the ability to project survivors volumetrically, kind of as holograms, and interact with them and ask questions. This project has caused some controversy for various reasons. You can imagine, holograms. But at the same time, it raises a lot of interesting questions about what a digital archive is and what kind of forms of mediation are available, or what we might create. We have examples of VR films, right, where you can go back in time and animate the archive in new ways using like an Oculus headset. We even have examples on Instagram where people have recreated stories and posted them as if they were stories on Instagram about Holocaust history and memory. We'll talk briefly about that towards the end. And today, if you use AI, you can talk to Anne Frank, apparently, using Hello History, which is a chat GPT interface that allows you to have conversations, ostensibly, with a survivor. Not a survivor in this case, with Anne Frank, but with really any historical figure. This raises all kinds of questions, not only around authenticity and where does this data source from and how is it used. I find this actually to be extremely problematic, and we can talk about that. But my point is that Holocaust testimony as a testimony is deeply connected with media forms and technology. So the other thing I want to mention, I mentioned this briefly, computation and complicity. One of the things that we do in the book is really talk about the way in which data collection practices had this underbelly in the history of eugenics, biostatistics, the history of optimizing workforces. And this is the Amsterdam 1941 A key figure here is the Inspectorate General of the Census in Amsterdam, who really oversaw the census that helped to locate all the Jews in Amsterdam and developed optimization technologies to round them up. So this is kind of the example of bare data and bare life. This is the reduction of people to nothing more than data points or calculations as a means to some other end. And algorithms potentially do this today. I mean, whether the ends may not be death, but they may be corporate surveillance. They may be corporate profit, right? This is, again, the potentiality of algorithms in complicity. We don't ignore this. This is a starting point for our research. A question that it raises kind of expands out a little bit is that what happens when you do have histories of numeracy, histories of turning people into data or numbers, like a slave ledger, which just gives the price of someone's worth to be sold in an economy, a slave economy. How do you imagine reparative data frameworks, right? In light of the history of reduction of people to just numbers or just numerical values or just amounts that they can be sold from, right? So it raises a very interesting question of how do you develop an architecture of reparation through digital technologies without replicating the very problem, the very violence that was at the heart of the original historical event. This project, I think, struggles with that as much as we struggle with it, I think, with working with some certain Holocaust archives, certainly perpetrator archives. All right, let's see, big data and the singular voice. I'll just move very quickly here is that the testimonies that we primarily work with are post-war testimonies recorded intentionally with survivors who were often interviewed in multiple languages, whether it was David Boder interviewing around 120 people in multiple languages, the USC Shoah Foundation's 55,000 testimonies, over 4,000 from the Yale Fortunov Archive, and a certain number from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. But all this raises the question again of it's impossible for a single person to listen to them all. It would take you a lifetime. And so relying on some kind of tools of technology can help us interpret them. But again, it raises the question of how to do so in responsible ways. I'll end with a little thing about technology itself, is that I would say that testimony has always been connected with testimony and technology have always gone hand in hand. And I think of that in terms of preservation, inscription, storage, transmission, whether it's a milk crate or a tin can. That's also a technology. And this is putting letters into a tin can and burying it in the Warsaw Ghetto and excavating it after the war in 1946 or 1950, and then trying to understand, what it would mean to send a testimony to the future. In many ways, the reason we have these testimony archives is they also are about the future. They're intended to bear witness beyond the specific moment that they were created. But how do they get to the future, right? In what form? What's the technology that carries them there? And then how do we interact with them? That's why the testimony and technology go hand in hand. Boder used this technology called a wire recorder, and we have the archive here at UCLA where these pictures come from. The wire is actually what contains the audio on the right-hand side. And even this is a very large archive, 800,000 words, over 100 interviews in 9 different languages, it turns out, of which Boder translated about 70 himself. What Boder says on the right there, and this I think is very inspirational for our own thinking, he says the point-by-point analysis of these unique documents, these testimonies, is a task of the future. It shall require the efforts of more than one investigator and the collaboration of experts of a most divergent scientific fields. It requires almost like digital humanities. It's a scientific and literary adventure, a form of experimental comprehension. That's kind of amazing, in 1948 to write that he was aware that kind of the analysis of these documents that he had created and recorded would require many different scientific fields to come together and different kinds of experimental forms of comprehension to understand them. So he made statistics, he made charts, he was interested in linguistics, many things that he was doing, even counting words with his team and his wife, Dr. Dora Boder. I'll end this in my last slide. He begins to develop this thing that we call an integrated methodology, very much referencing kind of Saul Friedlander's work of an integrated history, bringing together quantitative and qualitative methods, data and stories, distance and close perspectives, structures and people, statistical and historical approaches, numbers and voice. that there's something about the development of a methodology that will also help us understand the depth and complexity of these archives. So I'll end here. I'm going to welcome Anna to the actually, I'll just go right here. I'll end here and welcome you to talk a little about some of the methods, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
All right, yeah. Yeah, let's start from like a little bit of an overview of a few of the methods that we used in the book, and then go a little bit into some methods that I and my colleague used. But this is to give you a sense of, this is a collaborative work, and it was also a long work where a lot of methods were tried. Some work well, some not so well, some work better for some materials, some not. So the idea is we are not taking one method, one technology, and producing something with it. We are trying to follow some questions and pulling technologies that might help for this or that part of the work. We used network diagrams and data visualizations for a lot of the work that has to do with just visualizing main topics or keywords of what people are talking about. We used a constant, not used, but like we had a shift between, as you see, macro and micro analysis, or close reading, distant reading, meaning sometimes it's necessary to take a broad overview of a specific part of the collection, or maybe like the history behind a piece of the collection. And sometimes you want to read, specific parts of a testimony, or use maybe one specific technology to listen to a snippet of a testimony, or compare specific words maybe recur over different texts. We looked a lot into the idea of indexing, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, but basically the idea of how do you make sense of a really, really large amount of recordings and texts and transcriptions, and basically just content that is too much for one person. So how do you develop indexing methods to help you locate your content and like find the things that you need to analyze? And then we look at voice a lot, which is something that is very impactful for a user to listen to, but it's hard to analyze because it is sometimes hard to focus on a group of voices, or to focus on maybe the quality of the voice beyond the specific words that the person is saying. So we're going to go over that in a moment. And then we used other approaches that basically help us reconstruct a story from the voices and the testimonies of multiple speakers who do not even necessarily know of each other, but who will have something contribute to the same story, and we can sort of technologically pull it together. And then towards the end, I'm wondering if, anyway, I'm not sure who's going to talk about it, but the work of the lab is ongoing, and there's a lot more developments that are coming up, of course, with the new AI tools that are becoming available. We were talking earlier about how the projects that ended up in the cut for this book, they were all finalized just before AI became so available and so pervasive, and so the work is actually continuing. But yeah, let's focus for a moment on the question of indexing, meaning we have all these archives. Todd was talking just now about the 4 main archives that we worked with. So it's primarily audio files. Most of the time there are some transcripts for what the person was saying. Often there are indexes, basically just the list of keywords, topics that the person is talking about, or the survivor is talking about in their interview. And there were different methods that these indexes were developed. And the question for us, for our project, is what do these indexes help you find? And of course, most of the time, here an example that you see is on the left, an example of the Shoah Foundation indexing system. So when you watch one of the interviews, you don't always see the words, like the subtitles of the transcript, but you usually see an index of the main people, the main themes, the main locations that are being talked about in that part of the interview. And this is useful, right? You're doing a project where you need to find out where people are talking about, I don't know, Yugoslavia. And so you need to be able to find that. You cannot watch all the interviews. But for us, one of the problems was there is so much about what the person is saying, and the interaction between the speaker and the interviewer, and the emotional quality of the interview that cannot really be captured by this. And so if you're starting out on a project and you are going to the archive for the first time, you don't know what's there, and you can't find those parts. So a couple of the methods that were tried in our team to work around this problem and just try to imagine different ways of indexing the content. One was based on n-grams, the other one was based on triplets, and I'm gonna get there. When I say n-grams, I mean instead of looking at one word, look at 2, 3, 4 words, basically a little piece of a sentence. What you do is you take all of the text of what the person is saying, you chop it up in little pieces. I went to the person, the person and you see which ones of these little snippets are more frequent. Are there expressions that keep coming up? Are there expressions that multiple people are saying in the same or similar words? And then you group those by topic, which is tricky. Partially it's an automated process, partially it's a subjective process. Either way, it's a very recursive process. You do it by hand, and then you do it with the machine method, and then you again check it by hand. So it's a very recursive process. And what we found is that while the, let's say, noun-based indexing technique is really useful if you need to locate things like, on the left we see the references of places, or like macro categories, food, work. The indexing based on sentence snippets or n-grams is really useful to find the attitude of the speaker or the quality of the interview. These two images that you're seeing, the blue and the red, are two different ways of indexing the same text. So this is a very long interview, about 4 hours long, with an 18-year-old boy who was interviewed by Boder in 46. And he manually indexed the content of this interview, and then in our team, the indexing words used by Boder were actually summarized using the keyword system of the USC Shoah Foundation archive, so that it could be compared with other contents. And then the same interview was also indexed using this n-gram, or let's say phrase-based system. And you can see that different things come up, which doesn't mean one method is wrong and the other is right. It just means you need both if you're trying to find out different things about this text. And of course, when it's just one text, you could just read the text. But when it's 50,000 texts, you can't. One thing that was interesting was that the reticence or hesitation of the speaker in this interview, but also in the larger sample, really comes out when you look at specifically the way people keep stumbling on their words and hesitating. And this is something that may not really be that relevant if you're just reading one text and trying to mark keywords. Or also things like maybe the person is mentioning, in this case he mentions the Jewish Council, Jewish militias. He keeps mentioning actors, agents in the story that he's very concerned about. It's not one specific person, so it's not a perpetrator or a family member that you can put a name over and say he keeps talking about this character. It's more he's concerned with the agency of a certain group. So based on the different indexing method, you can really help different parts of the spirit of the interview to come to light. The second method that I was talking about just now, that was developed by Todd with some of our colleagues, mainly Li Jufan, is the idea that you might want to look at the way people express agency. I did something, we did something as a group, something was done to me, something was happening, and I was here. This is a way of reading the text that is both very close to the words, but also very distant, as in very machine-like. What you do is you don't take a word or a sentence, you pick out the main grammatical skeleton of the sentence, a subject, a verb, and one or more objects. Things like we can see, for example, from the orange bubble, we, and then the Star of David. What happens is that you can then take all of the subjects that were mentioned, all of the verbs, the relations, all of the objects, connect them and see who are people talking about, who are all of the different people that are involved by the same action, what are all of the different actions that appear when the speaker talks as we, versus what all the different actions that appear more when the speaker is like I saw this happen to me. So this is a way of really picking out individual words, but doing that at the scale of various hundreds of testimonies to really understand agency. And I think actually, never mind, let me move on, but we can maybe come back to this part for the questions. 3 more of the methods that I wanted to quickly go over. I think I'm maybe running out of time. We mentioned the voice. So a lot of the interviews that we looked at are really available as video recordings or audio recordings. So something that we did in the book was you can see, visually the sound wave of the interview stop where the wave is a little bit unusual. Is there a gap? Is there a silence? Is there a peak? Is this person speaking more slowly? Is the person speaking suddenly in a much higher pitch? And then you can see that at a distance, right? You see it. You see all of the interviews. When you see something peculiar, you look closer. What is the person talking about now? In the bottom one, for example, the person is talking about how his father died. His father was, I believe he died of starvation. And this is something that doesn't really come out by the way, but the things that he says about his father, but this is something that you see from his voice. So doing that at scales really helps you see the different parts of the interview that might require you to pause, look closer, and then analyze in that specific moment what's going on with the speaker. Another example of a technique that was used in the book was the idea of an ensemble, like a multi-voice testimony. The case study that we tried in the book is one of my favorites. It's a horrible story, but it's really fascinating. This person, Malat Smitbaum, she was a prisoner in Auschwitz who basically saved the lives of hundreds of people. She was in contact with a lot of different prisoners, which is why a lot of different people remember her. She actually died, but multiple people mention her by name. Sometimes they even mention her by the wrong name, but it's possible to find out that they're actually talking about her. And so by pulling together all of the different sentences from the different archives, when people talk about her, and then by extracting, okay, who are the other people who are being mentioned when Mala comes up, what's going on when they talk about her, you can really reconstruct the story of this person as if you had all of these witnesses telling you what they know about her in a way that is, completely unrealistic outside of this, let's say, digital bubble, because you're really pulling together voices of people who did not meet, are not even alive at the same time. And then finally, just really quickly, an approach that is really, really widespread in data analysis, but was really useful for us as well, topic modeling. You have large numbers of questions in this case, but also large numbers of answers in the interviews. We want to try to understand the interviewing process. What are interviewers asking about? What is the sequence of questions over the course of an interview? So part of the work that came in the book was trying to visualize in different ways the different things that were asked to survivors, so that you can look at it at a large scale and then maybe go pick specific questions, specific interviewers. I'm gonna stop here to give time to Rachel to talk, but just in general, something that really comes out from the book is the idea that these methods can help something emerge from the data and also see what else that method can do. So this is not a Holocaust methodology. This is a data methodology, a spoken word methodology. So it's really, you look at this data, you work on it, but then all of this different method keeps shifting depending on the question that you ask. I'm gonna stop, but I'm gonna let Rachel continue.
Hi everyone. So I have been really lucky to work with Todd on this lab for over a decade. And I have learned so much from my engagement with the lab and the various experiments, and from my colleagues like Anna, who kind of fluently move back and forth between the computation and the kind of more traditional humanities methods. Unfortunately, in that entire time, I did not pick up that fluency. So my role often in the lab was really to think about some of the questions that we were able to take out of the various experiments. And one of the things that I have gained through this engagement with the digital humanities and Holocaust testimony is not quite an integrated method, but I would say maybe a flipped method, an attention to the sources and an attention to the technologies that allows us to really highlight and understand the forms of mediation and the way technology has shaped what testimony and what witnessing has been collected back to the very beginning of really during the Holocaust, after the Holocaust, and then thinking ahead beyond that. So Todd kind of started earlier thinking about the ethics of the algorithm as a way to really apply humanistic arguments to computation, to preserve, to interpret, to perpetuate. I would push further to really think about how computation reshapes or really shapes testimony, right? It really informs the capture moment as one small example. Those wires that Todd showed an example of that David Boder carded, and he complained a lot about how heavy they were, but he carted them around post-war Europe. They only lasted for 29 minutes. And so the testimonies kind of had these short bursts, and then he would have to pause, and then he would have to get a new tape and restart them. The Shoah Foundation also has this kind of limit on how long people can talk, and so there's these unnatural breaks. And so really thinking about the way testimony is shaped by technology, by computation, and then how computation and technologies inform and create new points of access. So again, trying to think about the DH methods beyond computation, and really focusing on an awareness and appreciation of sources, recognizing where there are gaps because that's intentional, where there are gaps because there just is missing, right? So thinking really closely about our sources, and paying attention to the ways that new questions can form around materiality and meaning. So why were certain tools used in certain ways? And I'm going to come back to that in a second. And how did certain materials enable different kinds of stories to be told? And then also, how do various forms of technology, again, shape not only our access to it, but our understanding and our engagement with it. So we're going to head towards social media and our engagement with Holocaust memory on social media. But first, I have a book coming out in May, as Tim very generously shared with all of you. But my book looks at the 1940s and early 1950s, and tries to offer a little bit of a longer history of Holocaust narrative making and survivor witnessing in American context in particular. And so this is just some of the kinds of sources that I look at in the book, but already there's a lot of technologies actually that when we start to pay attention, we can see how these different materials were creating different points of access and engagement for American audiences. So we have David Boder with his wire recorder, but the one just below him, that's actually Paul Muni. He was a very famous actor, and he performed on the radio as Holocaust survivors, including Kurt Meyer, in this long story called Displaced. It was a whole Holocaust narrative on the radio. There were lots of them. It's really great history. We can talk more about that at any time. There were also kind of fundraising brochures you can see in the top corner, and the kind of framing of American freedoms and opportunity for these young survivors who came to the United States. Pen pal program, so this young girl was a pen pal for some donor in America and would write about her experience and send the picture. And then in 1953, on This Is Your Life, you can see Hannah Bloch-Kohner, the first Holocaust survivor on TV in the 1950s. So lots of different media types, lots of different technologies that first introduced these narratives into the American discourse and into public engagement, public opportunities. And then we kind of jump to the 90s. We can see Fritzi Fritschall from her interview in the 90s with the Shoah Foundation. And then the one on the far side is from her Dimensions and Testimony interview in 2019, I think, yeah. And there's lots we can talk about here, and I think if you guys are interested in talking more about Dimensions and Testimony, maybe that can come up with the questions. But one of the things I think we can see by looking at the difference in these materials is just from a visual standpoint right now, the different interfaces. We can ask questions like, why did the Shoah Foundation put a black backdrop, right? Like if anyone's watched lots of VHA testimonies, the backgrounds, the settings that the survivors are sitting in tell so much about their lives in America, and we lose that when we jump to this black screen where we create more digital spaces for them. But also the experience of what it means to listen and learn from these testimonies is wildly different. So the Shoah Foundation materials, you can access them from any point through the index. But you can also listen to them as an entire testimony from the beginning to the end. You can follow the arc of the narrative that the Shoah Foundation created, but that the survivor really wants to take you on, and that's something we can talk more about as well if you want. The Dimensions and Testimony, on the other hand, you can never listen to the full testimony. There is no beginning, middle, and end of this story. It is an opportunity for you as the viewer to ask questions and engage with the digital representation of the survivor, but we don't ever have an opportunity to hear a story or to listen to testimony in the way that we might think about it. So what does that mean for other kinds of forms of engagement? This is one example of Holocaust narrative on Instagram and on this same on TikTok, so on social media. It's a project called Ava's Stories and a diary of a Holocaust victim, so already this is quite different than survivor testimony that we might think about, was produced by a filmmaker and then shared on Instagram in little Instagram story bits for about 3 years in a row on Holocaust Remembrance Day. And one of the things that's really captivating here is the idea that the creators said, we're going to create Holocaust memory where the young people are. So there was an intention behind the project to really bring this kind of engagement to younger people so they could learn about and remember the Holocaust in a particular way. But what we also see is this idea that they started off the project saying, what would have happened if a young Holocaust victim had social media? But they don't actually engage with actually what would have happened, right? So we can think about the ways that people respond to genocide on social media, around violence that is shared on social media, and none of the kind of comment problems, none of these things come up in this project. So on the one hand, there's this kind of push towards sharing narratives with wider audiences, and on the other hand, really curating how those engagements can go. I'm going to just share one more example of social media that I think speaks to the same question of what happens when we start to really take seriously the interfaces where we find and engage with Holocaust memory. This is a project called the St. Louis Manifest. This is like a Twitter-specific project that was launched in 2017 by a scholar named Russell Neese. And it was meant to really speak to the question of refugees as it was popping up in 2017. And so this is a really good combination of this integrated methodology where Russell created an algorithm that pulled from a database from the US Holocaust Museum that listed all 900 members of the 900 people that were on the St. Louis, which, if you're not familiar, was a ship that brought people from Europe who were hoping to find asylum in the United States and was turned away. And so the project, throughout the 24 hours of Holocaust Remembrance Day, tweets out information in a kind of standardized sentence about the 900 people that were on the St. Louis. When there's pictures available, he includes those as well. And one of the things that's come up kind of in public discourse around the Holocaust for social media in particular is this an appropriate platform for thinking about Holocaust memory, right? So there, on the one hand, we have this idea that Holocaust memory should be where young people are. We should create opportunities for them to engage with it. And on the other hand, we have this idea that this is an inappropriate space for it. And I think one of the ways that we can bring a kind of close attention to what it means to have Holocaust memory on social media is to really think about, like, what is the goal of our engagement with Holocaust media? Are we taking time out of our lives to go to a museum, to log onto a website? Are we like putting ourselves in a specific headspace? Or in these cases, I think we have a kind of example of a digital Stolperstein where we are tripping over Holocaust memory. And what does that mean for our daily lives when it's not something we're kind of designating space for, but really something we're engaging with in ways that are inconvenient and maybe disruptive. And that is kind of where the last chapter of the book kind of ends, with these questions around, what happens next? What do we do with all this new media forms of Holocaust memory, and how do we bring our attention and care to assessing the meaning of these materials?
It's a book that, as you can see, is well worth reading, so I'd really recommend it to you. What I wanted to do was maybe just to offer a few reflections from my perspective, and then actually to go back to what Anna was looking at and maybe to probe some questions, or kind of almost like some provocations, I suppose, that it'd be really great to get a response from before we open up for questions. There's a moment right at the beginning of the book in the preface where I think it's Todd's voice writes, "The big problem is this. Without objectifying survivors or reducing the study of the Holocaust to quantitative abstractions, how can computational methods be used in ethical ways to further our understanding of the memory and history of the Holocaust?" And I think that big problem is really what drives the book. And I think what's interesting to me about the book is that early on, Todd is well aware that the technologies will change. And at the end of the book, I think it was a couple of years in the press. The presses are always slow with these kinds of things. In the couple of years that it was sitting with the press, the technology has changed enormously, in particular around generative and hermeneutic AI. But I think the technologies are not the thing that really matters in this book. There's multiple technologies at play in the book, and there's multiple technologies that could be at play. I think it's the big problem that's at the center, and I think that's what's really strong about the analysis, is that in a sense, this isn't saying like this technology is okay, that technology is not okay. It's actually asking a more fundamental question, which is, well, what do we do about the fact that we have, on the one hand, large data sets? If you think of the Shoah Foundation archive, I think Todd estimates it takes you 30 years to watch every interview, and that's 12 hours a day. It's a humanly impossible task. And yet here we have a range of technologies and big computing that allows us to do something. And the question that Todd really pushes and the team throughout the book is, where do we draw the line? Like, what do we do and what don't we do? Are there ethical questions at play? And I think, to me, that's what's really strong about this work as a kind of intervention into digital humanities. I think Todd, in many ways, I think is doing the really key leading work here around thinking critically and hard about the ethics of DH. I'm someone who works in digital humanities. I guess a lot of my work maybe is slightly ethically light and much more around kind of using digital humanities tools within analysis and to offer new perspectives within Holocaust studies. But I think there's a real value to a book like this, which forces all of us, in a sense, to ask a set of questions that I think, as I'll maybe reference at the end, I think are relevant for those of us who maybe don't see ourselves as digital humanists as well. Second thing that I think is striking, and you've already got a sense of this, is that this isn't just a kind of lab-based book that's written by a team, but it's also very much a book, and Anna mentioned this, which is very iterative and processual, that digital humanities, in a sense, are not the kind of final piece that are presented to us, but is actually a way of experimenting. And I think Anna used the word of experimentation as a process. And I think this is interesting as well about bringing, again, something maybe from STEM, from the science model, not just the kind of lab as a group of people from different disciplinary practices, but the lab as a kind of play space, a place where experimentation happens and multiple kinds of visualizations and multiple kinds of tools are utilized to ask questions, some of which are kind of interesting, and critically, I think, to provoke new questions. And I think a little bit of that comes through in the book because of the nature of how the chapters are developed. You get a sense, and I don't know if it was intentional, but I got a sense that in some ways there is a sense of following a team on a journey through a kind of iterative processual process to a point where actually they're riffing off what they've just done in the last set of experiments that informs a new set of experiments. And there's a kind of openness there, which I think is really important. And I think Todd would probably see that as part of the ethics of the algorithm, is partly around a sense of openness, in ways that I'll say a bit more about in a moment. Just final thing in terms of one thing that really strikes me about the book is Todd talks about a multi-scalar zoom, or as he mentioned, an integrated methodology riffing off Shaw Friedlander's work on integrated histories of the Holocaust that bring together perpetrator voices and victim voices. And one thing that I think is really strong in the book is this way that it moves, it constantly toggles and moves between distant reading and close reading, between an entire index for 54,000 interviews and then just 13 seconds of one interview, with a sense that actually both of those are possible. And that kind of, I almost think of it as like an accordion, that sense of kind of breathing in and breathing out, of going large and going small, of distant reading, close reading, I think is something that is really striking about this book, and is one thing I want to reference in a moment, because I think it's one of the real values of this book, is that it encourages that kind of expansiveness, or that sense of maybe agility for those of us within the digital humanities, of really working at different scales and resolutions. And that's one of the things that an archive of 54,000 interviews allows us to do, doesn't it? We can listen to the whole archive, and we can listen really attentively to just 13 seconds, or maybe it's 18 seconds, I can't remember, of one particular interview. But I also wanted to offer some provocations. It's a brilliant book, and I hope you'll read it. But I also wanted to offer a number of provocations, in some ways to encourage maybe the team to go a little bit further. Like, I guess reading this, I wondered if you drew the line a little bit closer to a point that I would want to step over. And so in some ways I'm going to almost suggest 5 ways you might step over the line, and I'd be really interested in your response to that. So the first actually is around indexing. This is a brilliant slide, I think, that Anna talked about, which is, here's an entirely different way that you can imagine indexing an archive. That you could look for every place where a survivor says, I don't know or I didn't know. Like the place where someone doesn't have an answer could be a whole new way of interacting with an archive, or the places, some of the work I'm doing at the moment, which is about silence, like where does a survivor say nothing? In a classic interview, which is based entirely on content, doesn't do that, because it's a thematic interview indexing. So the way of navigating the archive at the moment is through thematic indexing, whether that be Boda's initial indexing or the VHA's indexing, which is an extraordinary task. And I think one thing that's really striking about this work is that here's potential multiple opportunities. In a sense, there's an endless array of ways in which you can access the archive. And there's something which I really think is striking in the book, where they talk about this being a democratic process, a kind of democratization of the archive, which I actually really buy, which is that there's a sense that if you have an archive of 54,000 interviews, what tends to happen is that the 1,000 on YouTube are listened to and the 53,000 not on YouTube aren't, or maybe 53,998 disappear, and there's 2 interviews that assume a kind of canonical status. And there's something, I think, about this way of creating multiple ways into an archive that draws attention to interviews that maybe we've never heard, or voices that have not been heard. And I think that, for Todd, is part of the ethics of an algorithm, is the ethical possibility. He talks in the book about algorithmic interfaces, and I really buy that. I guess the one thing I'd want to push a little bit more is about algorithmic analysis. There's a sense, I think, in which there's a little bit of a line that's drawn in the book about the algorithm. We'll let the algorithm do this, but we won't let the algorithm do that. A kind of happiness with the algorithm being the way into the archive, but less with the way of analysing the archive. And maybe I'd want to suggest a bit more. For example, here I think don't know, didn't know. To me, actually, I think there's algorithmic analysis that could be really interesting there about who says they don't know and didn't know. How does that map out across gender? Is that something that women are more likely to say than men? Is it within certain contexts? Like, how does that play out across time? Who's owning up to not knowing and who's much more assured in their knowing? And I think the algorithm, in a sense, could be pushed a little bit more into that analysis. Second thing, semantic triples. Now this, I think, to me was the part of the book that I loved the most, and where what I think the book does is it speaks more widely to historians and humanists beyond just digital humanists. There's a phrase that's coined called algorithmic close reading, which I think is a really interesting and provocative idea. And one of the defenses that the authors offer about the value of algorithms is that their suggestion is that algorithms read and listen differently to humans. Like, algorithms count in different ways. They pay attention to different kinds of things. That a computer with a large text reads a large text in a way that's very different from the way we read. They come with a different set of lenses. And I think what's most striking for me is the way that in one section of the book, what Todd and his team do is they apply that way of thinking to a close reading of 4 interviews. And I think this is really an interesting and exciting work, whereby, in a sense, what we're asking the computer to do in this case is to think about semantic triples, so literally just to think about object, verb, subject, becomes a way that then I think about a text in a close reading, which is a kind of clunky way. And of course, when we read text and do close reading, we kind of do that, we assume that, but we don't do that in a way that pays particular attention to it. And I think in that chapter, I'm really struck by the way that I think there's a genuine historiographical contribution in that chapter, where what I think you show really clearly is the way that micro acts of resistance are all the way through these narratives. In places where you might expect them, in, say, 1930s Germany, but also in places where you don't expect them, like in Auschwitz, or within the camp system. that paying attention, focused attention on whether this is an active or passive verb, of what someone is doing and where someone is going, suddenly highlights and draws attention to a really central historiographical question within Holocaust studies, which is what's the nature or extent of victim agency, in particular within certain spaces like the camp. And I think, to me, that was one of the most exciting chapters, in a sense, is where we learn from a way of thinking that is characteristic of the algorithm, but maybe we apply it in a close reading way as humanists. In a sense, I think what I found really exciting about that was the way that actually by working within digital humanities, it's not just a whole new method, but a whole new way of thinking, or a whole new way. In a sense, I felt like you were almost being like the machine. So you were trying to think like the algorithm as a historian. And I actually think that really worked well. At the moment when you think like an algorithm, I think there's new thinking that's taking place. And in some ways, I think there's that dance in some ways between the humanist and the algorithm and the humanist. And that I think thinking like an algorithm has something that really bears fruit in this particular part of the text. Third thing, one thing that does strike me is the way that you grapple with the orality of oral history. And I think that's often one thing that doesn't tend to happen within DH projects. Digital humanities projects, drawing especially on corpus linguistics, tend to reduce an oral history interview down to a transcript. And yet we know that actually most of what's happening in an oral history interview is not just what someone's saying, but how they're saying it. And this is something that is really powerfully demonstrated in the section where you look at things like voice tone and silences, like the long silences, where something becomes almost unspeakable. But here is something that I do want to kind of provoke you with, which is I get a sense that this is when you get to the voice, you get almost to a kind of sacred territory. What I think it really struck me reading the book, and this is my own kind of like riff on reading the book, was that if you think about any oral history archive or a testimony archive, it's made up of 4 elements. It's got the metadata, which includes the index, but it includes all sorts of things like, who's the interviewer, when is the interview undertaken, by which organisation. So there's a whole set of metadata. Then you have the questions asked by the interviewer, which are recorded in the transcript, but also would have their own orality about them. Thirdly, you have the answers given by the interviewer within the transcript, which is largely about words and content. And then fourthly, you actually have the voice of the interviewee as well, so the spoken words of the interviewee. And my sense was that you apply different methods to those. And although you don't explicitly say this, I think you see a different kind of ethics to those 4 different types of sources. That I don't think you just say, to hell, whatever can happen to the metadata, but I kind of think you sort of do. You feel like there's no ethical questions about the metadata, like you can do whatever you want with the metadata. I think you are fairly happy to do whatever you want with the questioner's questions. Like I think you're happy to trust the algorithm with the questions asked. I think you start to get less sure when it gets to the point of the answers. And then I'm really struck by the way that you draw a line. We drew a limit at extrapolating or generalizing anything from the individual voice of a survivor. And I'm really interested in that sort of sense of splitting up an archive and the kind of complex layers of an archive and saying there's a kind of a different ethics for the different elements of this testimonial archive. And there's an ethics here at the level of the voice, which is the most kind of conservative ethics, I guess, and then there's a different ethics at the level of the metadata. And I'd be really interested in your reflections on that, especially as we maybe think about the opportunities of, say, the digitization of the vast ITS archive. A perpetrator-created document, do we have a different set of ethical considerations about the algorithm vis-a-vis kind of something generated by the perpetrator than we do the kind of the voice of the victim? Fourth thing, and I've got one more after that, I'm almost done, honest. Fourth thing, this, to me, really interested me, where you talk about multi-voice testimony. There's an idea of what is termed testimonial ensemble that you work with here, which is to think about how you bring together multiple voices about one particular individual. So it's one particular prisoner in Auschwitz who, in a sense, is seen from multiple perspectives. So from the perspectives of 28 different survivors. Now, I got a sense here that you were choosing your words carefully, Todd. And I felt like this is very much Todd's writing here, just because I know Todd and his work a little bit more, and his reading, that I think you chose testimonial ensemble as a way really of, and you explicitly say this, of working with some of the ideas of Hayden White, really important work within historiography in the 1990s, in particular around the limits of representation of certain events, and in particular an event, a modernist event like the Holocaust. One of the things that Hayden White suggests is that in some ways what we need are these kinds of more multiple, complex, shifting kinds of narratives, different narrative structures, different narrative modes, different ways of plotting certain kinds of violent events like the Holocaust. And in a sense, I think, Todd, you see this, or maybe see if this is my reading is correct. I think you see testimonial ensemble as a way of, in a sense, being true to Hayden White, whilst also working with algorithms. So I sort of felt you were caught in some ways between Hayden White and the algorithm. And we're trying to bring them together within this idea of the testimonial ensemble. Now, I wonder whether there's more that you could do here without becoming a naive positivist. One thing that really struck me was that you were very reticent to engage in generalization, to engage in quantitative abstraction, or to engage in empiricist extrapolation. And I wondered if there was a sense in which a kind of fear of offending Hayden White, in some ways, led you not to go as far as you might. And in some ways I'd want to push you here a little bit more, that I think what happens in this chapter is more than an ensemble. I think to me it's becoming algorithmic analysis, and that I think there's a kind of empiricism to it, which I don't see as problematic, if it's an empiricism that is kind of open and generous and fluid and flexible in the ways that Hayden White maybe suggested. And final thing, just referring to topic modelling, one of the things that I really was interested here was to think about, and this is like maybe an entirely different project and an entirely different book, is whether you could imagine that ensemble of 28 testimonies around one woman set within a kind of almost like 3D constructed model that includes what you know about the entire archive and the testimony. And what I mean by that is that I, in some ways, really wanted a moment maybe in the book where you brought everything together, where orality was brought together with what is said about this woman, is brought together with the nature of the exchange between the interviewer and the interviewee, whether that's moments of long soliloquies or whether it's a short, sharp set of to's and fro's. Are there moments of reticence within this? Where does this sit within the institutional archive? How is it indexed? How is it thought of? And in some ways, that's the one thing that I almost was wishing for, or was almost a kind of final moment, a final chapter of bringing everything together. And I don't know if there's an impossibility to that, because I'm imagining some kind of massive, almost like kind of 3D model, where I'm able to explore multiple 28 testimonies of one woman within the wider context and framing of how those testimonies were created, and all of the kind of metadata. So if you get back to my 4 layers, you've got the metadata, you've got the question, you've got the content answer, you've got the orality. Like, is there a way in which we can think about an algorithm or ways of representing or visualizing that would enable us to bring all of that together within one space? Because I think there might be really interesting analytical possibilities there. And in a sense, I guess that's one thing that I'm really conscious of in my own work around digital humanities, is how can digital humanities really grapple with some of those kinds of richer, broader, critical historiographical questions. And in a sense, I think that's what I really value about this book, is that it's a book that grapples deeply with those kinds of questions and grapples with a rich historiographical tradition, to offer not simple answers, but to do something much more sophisticated. So just a few reflections from me, and a few questions maybe over to you to give some answers. Todd, I don't know if who wants to start off, but maybe if you want to respond to those, and then we'll open up to
we can all
questions from the
respond
floor.
in different ways. Yeah. Do you want to? Something you want to say after the start?
Can I take
Please.
the first one about
please.
you were talking about the 4 layers and how, and how it seems like the book projects get more cautious and cautious as you get closer and closer. I worked mostly on the indexing part, and many of my colleagues were working on the different scales. The sense that I get is you get more cautious when the scale gets smaller because of how much damage you could do if you get it wrong at a smaller scale versus a large scale. So for example, I remember that during one of the editing phases of the book, we were double checking numbers, and I was double checking how many times a certain expression was recurring, and I had, my count was wrong, and so I had to fix the number of how many times the expression was actually said. But if I'm putting together one expression that was, pronounced 67 times, and I get it wrong and the expression actually was pronounced 69 times, it's a mistake that I fixed with my finger and my keyboard. Because I'm not putting any one specific person on the spot or any specific expression. But I imagine that if I try to overinterpret, for example, what a very specific, moment in the voice of one survivor means, and I maybe project too much of the research onto that one voice, then I'm really putting one specific existing person on the spot. So I guess you're asking about are there different ethics, and of course I can only speak for myself, but because we're really moving between different scales, my impression is, you get more cautious when it gets more real, more human, more close. Whereas you can, you have less potential to do damage when you're looking at you still have the potential to mess it up and really make the archive say something that it isn't saying. So that's where the rest of the ethics comes in. But the scale is definitely different.
I mean, yeah, I think I do agree with the broad aspect that Anna said. And I think you're right to identify from the metadata to the questions to the answer to the voice, a change in where the line is. So the metadata is created after the fact by archivists, by information studies folks, especially with regard to the Shoah Foundation. This was a manual process of people being trained to listen to the testimony, and even an algorithmic process by which 1 minute segments they had a machine. Every 1 minute you were prompted to provide an indexing term. And then the index is this large hierarchical index that was developed after the fact to describe the content of the testimonies. In the chapter, I wrote about the history of this indexing system, this process. But it's not only an index that I'd say is very much, as Anna mentioned, shifted towards nouns, basically named entities. They're talking about Auschwitz, and it's this particular time, it's this particular group of people. And it misses so much that we're talking about, right, in terms of voice, inflection, emotion, but also often parts of the story that are just simply not indexed by this kind of ontology, which is a kind of hierarchical noun-based ontology. So that, I think, in terms of messing with the metadata is already messing with testimony. It's an interpretive work, and it's changed over time. The index has evolved and changed, and one of the things I try to do in the book, too, is this is a place where we do comparative work. We bring in the Armenian genocide testimonies that are also now part of the Shoah Foundation, the Nanjing massacre testimonies that they did in collaboration with the University of Nanjing, and also a set of Rwandan testimonies that were also done in collaboration with partners in Rwanda. And what I thought was so, both, I think, provocative and problematic is to use the same indexing that was developed for the Holocaust to talk about these other genocides, when in fact they're culturally and linguistically and geographically and historically very distinct. And there were even terms and experiences from other genocides that could have inflected the way they indexed the Holocaust, but did not. And so that's really interesting to me then, so it goes in one direction. So there, I think it's really, you have to interpret the metadata. You have to kind of understand these decisions that are being made at the archive. With regard to the questions, I think there's also much to be found there, because guidance given to interviewers about what kind of questions to ask, which ones are banned, even the phrasing. This is something that for the Fortuna from the 1980s was talking about. You can't ask leading questions in certain ways. But if you go to Boder and you look at his questions, they were just not downright sometimes aggressive. I mean, it would be one way to say it. He would tell us, the interviewer, don't talk about that, I don't want to hear about this. He would even, at some points, he was not always the best interviewer. And one of the things that we did in analyzing the 16,000 or so questions that he asked is also look at gender differences. And there, I think there is an empiricist kind of approach, which is we found that there were very clear differences of questions that he asked to women versus men in terms of content, tending to ask family questions about, I'd say women, kind of what we're seen as kind of particularly more traditional women's roles. The men were asked much more historical questions, kind of questions about experiences. There were some really interesting differences that we could show empirically. So I think that's one example where we did do some empirical work. Answers and voice, I think, are aligned. And I tell you that they're different ways. So the triplets, you can trace back a triplet always to a testimony. We never, you never made a triplet up. This is exactly a grammatical feature of a testimony. It's a unit of speech that you can always go back to and look at. And voice as well, a visualization of voice on a spectrogram is also an articulation of breath and I think, vocal intensity and many other things, and vocal qualities. I found it to be a problem to extrapolate meaning from a small set of examples of when the voice does this, it must mean that. That was the problem that I had with kind of empiricist extrapolation. And instead, I used it as a way of helping us guide our listening and our reading to attend to things in a voice that may not be recognized when we're only working on a transcript. And that's, we can debate, whether one should do this or not, but that was, you're exactly right to indicate that there was different lines at different times in terms of how we approach the analysis. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I want to speak to your kind of idea that there's a 3D opportunity for us to engage with these different layers. And I don't know if Anna would agree with this, but I think one of the things we did in the lab was enact that kind of interactivity where somebody would be working on computation, they would bring in a new visualization, then we'd say well, what number testimony are you working on? And then someone else in the lab would pull up the testimony and we could listen to that exact minute where they were pulling from the computation. And I think that toggling back and forth is what informed so much of just the kind of intellectual motivation and the work of the lab over so many years. And it's compelling to think about what would that be like to create something that would enable more people? What would a workspace look like? What would a sandbox look like where other people could experiment with that opportunity to go back and forth, working with the knowledge of computer scientists and Holocaust historians to kind of push that conversation back and forth. It's exciting.
Great, thanks so much. Let's open it for questions. Feel free, just maybe in the blue shirt first.
My question's about the relationship between close reading and distant reading. How do you bridge the gap between these two interpretive methods in order to create a more objective evaluation of whatever topic you're studying? And then related, can or should an objective evaluation be created?
I don't go first.
I can maybe take a small part of the question and then, so I think I'm going to start from one of the words you said, creating an objective evaluation. I want to really not go there because I feel that can actually restrict your analysis or make your analysis say things that are not in the text. I think that, of course, you should strive for a certain level of objectivity. You can't make up what the work is about. But I think that could be a destination point, but not a guiding criteria in choosing when to do close reading versus when to do distant reading, because that might lead to creating maybe a scheme for, okay, let's examine all the words at a large scale with an algorithm, then let's close read a sample of, 2 testimonies. I feel that trying to systematize that might be of disservice to the different interviews, because the interviews are of very different nature, across the archives, but even within the same archive. So I think that maybe a certain level of objectivity can be reached by being very transparent about the switch between the different methods that you did, the motivation behind certain actions, but not objectivity in terms of creating a very reproducible process for every step of the analysis. Yeah.
I could add maybe just something really short. I mean, I think that we're definitely, as Tim, you mentioned, kind of toggling back and forth between these two kinds of readings, and it's probably a meso level as well. So, close, middle, distance. Distant reading is useful for structures and patterns. And one of the things we did was look at all the metadata in the Shoah Foundation's 55,000, actually a little less than that, like 45,000 Jewish survivor testimonies, and look at the degree to which it achieved the goals that the Shoah Foundation articulated in terms of narrative structure. So they had an idea of what a testimony looked like. It's going to have about 20% of time before the war. It's going to have about 60% of time, what happened during the war with a set of different kinds of questions, depending on the experience of the survivor, and about 20% after the war, and then about the very last part about kind of like a future message or the legacy or meaning of the Holocaust. If voters' testimonies don't look anything like that. They don't have that kind of chronological sequencing. They'll jump all around. And I would say other archives, and I think the Armenian Genocide Archive testimonies are also, which were done in the 70s and 80s, completely different. They don't have this imposition of a narrative chronological structure, let alone particular practices in terms of how they're going to be filmed. And so you have a much more kind of experimental, I would say, approach to interviewing, many different witnesses at once, going on walks, kind of sitting over dinner, people interrupting, a much more and a very different kind of range of, I'd say, forms of expressivity and participation. The Shoah Foundation was very much about standardizing an interview practice. And so we wanted to see the extent to which, based on the metadata, they actually achieved this. And so we could look at all 55,000, and then we can find ones that deviated from it, which is really interesting too, because that also tells you that not everyone kind of subscribed to, like, this is how I'm going to tell my story. I might want to tell my story differently. And they, in fact, start with something that normally comes later, but they actually start very earlier. So that's one way that kind of distance and close can go together, is that it can kind of like, you can see the archive as a whole, but then you can find differences and sort of these non-normative elements that then can draw you in to figure out, okay, what is this story? Why is it so different? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just here, the lady just on the second row, yeah.
My question, I think, a little bit more about kind of the inception of the work. I really love this intersection between kind of this humanistic, historiographical work and then also the computational methodology. And so the question that I would ask is, how do you, or was there a particular kind of way of thinking that you approach this work with in terms of not subscribing to the idea of having like a slippery slope of applying computation to this work? Because I always in my own work am thinking about how do I not only stop myself from going places that I shouldn't ethically or whatever else in the amount of empirical work that I do, but then also how would I kind of craft my work in a way that doesn't make it okay for other people to continue on in that way, in a way that maybe ethically we don't want to.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the work was, I don't know, how long has this lab been going on? 14 years, 15
I think like
years?
2014 or
Yeah.
something, right?
I think that part of the reason for that is actually at the core of your question, which is that Todd mostly, but we weren't ready to publish something until we had a really clear sense of like what it was that the work wanted to say, or what was like what was the structure that was worth putting out there. Mm-hmm. Who were we talking to? We had a lot of conversations about like who's the audience for this book, and there were, I don't know if exponentially, but there were significantly more experiments than are captured in the book. And so I think part of what made this work so special, and for me so really informative about how to apply it to other kinds of research and other kinds of work, is that it wasn't intended with an end result in mind, right? So there was an openness to really thinking about like, okay, the Shoah Foundation has all of this data. What is this data actually telling us? And so we started from a place of like, we believe that these testimonies have meaning. Can computation help us understand that meaning in new ways, create new opportunity for understanding and thinking? And I think that pursuit kind of sustained the work, and feeling like, yeah, we were driven by the work that survivors did to put these testimonies out there. I never felt like, oh, we're slipping into some dangerous space. I think we kept sight of like, the survivors have given these testimonies and it's our job to find meaning and purpose in them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for new generations to continue to do so with maybe as tools evolve, and also as those, I guess, the physical experience becomes less and less possible. So we're just going to have archives. I mean, that's all we're going to have. We're going to have archives of material, and so it's really incumbent on us to figure out how do we listen to it? How do we engage with it? I mean, that's this is the inheritance that you have from any major historical event.
Yeah, just gentleman here, and then we'll get to the lady there. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a very unique universal project. Usually when you have a project like this, you are focused on a particular demographic. The variables are concentration camp, the geographical origin of the people is different, the demographics is different, the gender is different. Now, what I want is there any standardization, or are the answers consistent? Is it different for females, for demographics, for males? How do you kind of consolidate all this data?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually, that kind of gets at your question as to can we do that kind of social science work? And to be honest, that's actually not the main questions that we were asking. We did ask that with regard to, I think, the questions and the interviewers, particularly if there were variances in how people asked questions, what kind of topics were covered, and also when they asked questions, and even who they asked questions of. And so we knew something about the demographics there. But some of this research is happening now in the social sciences and political science. I think like Sharon Walter's work is a good example of this. There's a lot of people, I think, who are usefully looking at sort of demographic variables and trying to figure out, did women tell stories in different ways? The use of certain use of we versus I is an example. I think some of the work that you're doing, Tim, looking at examples of solidarity tend to occur more often in women's narratives than in men's narratives, and also in particular places. So there are, remember, these stories obviously are constructed. I mean, and they're constructed in very particular moments as the survivors, reflecting and finding the language and being part of an interview and so forth. And they may feel comfortable saying certain things. They may feel comfortable expressing certain things. To me, I would always want to take it all with a grain of salt, because I always remember the constructedness of all these different layers. But I think in broad brushstrokes, people have shown some very significant differences in terms of how women and men, articulate their stories. I don't know if there's more you want to add there.
Oh, I would just add that David Boder actually did a lot of that work. So he did a lot of social scientific analysis of women, men, where were his interviewers from. He added computational write-ups to different kinds of trauma that he self-defined. So there is a history of that kind of work that is part of our conversations, but it wasn't something that we picked up from Boder to keep doing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your work and sharing it with us. I have a question about how you think your archive in the technical application of the algorithm to a very painful archive elaborates a notion of algorithmic justice, or how you think about algorithmic justice specifically rather than general concept of justice, because the overwhelming kind of scholarly work on algorithm is on algorithmic injustice.
Right.
So, but you're providing a kind of opening for thinking about algorithmic justice. So maybe if you could speak a little bit on justice.
Yeah, thanks. That's such a great question, Munia. Thank you so much. I mean, we reference, some of my colleagues' work, like Safiya Noble, who wrote a book called Algorithms of Oppression, is very much in my mind. And I think it should be in all of our minds, because we know that certainly in the hands of, I think, particular corporate ends, algorithms are used to profile. They're used, more than just create echo chambers and recommendation bubbles, but also, I think, to distract and potentially to brutalize. And so, when I mentioned at the beginning, this kind of this potentiality of how we kind of, I think, approach algorithms, and then we don't mean algorithms only in terms of the computational processes, but we mean them in a kind of the broader socio-technical way. They're people, they're programs, there's applications, and there's machine processes of parsing data and doing things with data. So for us, it is actually to know that this is possible, and that this is not only know that it's possible, that it even is part of the history of the Holocaust. That's why I started in the 1920s, like with the biostatistics and eugenics and this kind of this practice of counting and calculating people. But the question really is, are these tools inherently dangerous, bad, brutalizing? And I think what we're trying to show here is that there are is a need to develop, I would say, an ethics of the algorithm if we're going to use these tools and these kind of processes in any other way except ways that are not oppressive and brutalizing. And so some of the things that we try to show is that algorithms, it goes back to that question of attention, help us to attend to things that have not been fully recognized or known. And why that's important is if you're searching, an archive, again, only the things that have been noticed or marked up are going to be things you can find. And so the whole point is like, can we open this up? Can we find lesser known stories? Can we democratize the archive, as you said, in the sense that all voices are given equal importance as opposed to just a few canonical voices? What happens to those other 50,000 voices? And so there's a lot of stories of people you've probably never heard of in this book. And as I say, they're not the canonical figures. And that's the point, is to bring out these stories in ways that puts them in, I guess, at the same level of other stories that maybe we do know and that we know well. It doesn't necessarily displace them. It just says that, look, there's other ways that we can know. So I'd say it's to add more layers of meaning, more ways of interpreting, new ways of listening, really to help us do humanities work, interpretive work. And that, I think, is the way that, there may be an algorithmic justice here. It's an algorithmic justice insofar as maybe it's a new fidelity to the diversity of the archive.
I think we've got time for one last question. Yeah, just the gentleman there in the that's you. And then I think we'll have time for a conversation afterwards.
One, I would love to talk shop a little bit about digital methods and some of the things sometimes swing back the sandbox. But then my question is, and I was really motivated by seeing your sons and the data part of it. And I know we're the humanities, and I know we're obsessed with books, and we need books for everything. What about we envision your project as not a book? And where would you go with this if you didn't need to produce a codex? Like, how would you view this as like a system or some kind of other contribution?
Maybe I'll start with that one.
Yeah,
okay.
Please.
So when I was finishing up my PhD here at UCLA and was deeply embedded in this work and was better framed as a digital humanist, I created a kind of scalar website about my research. And I was really excited about it because it was an opportunity for people to access the work, access the sources that I had kind of pulled out of the archive, and could invite people to listen to materials, watch films that had been really lost from the longer history of the Holocaust archive. And it's now, many years later, and Scalar doesn't work as well, the links don't work. So there's a kind of constants to the updating that I think actually ends up taking so much time and attention and care, and you have to write a grant to port over the material to make sure it's in the right format. That's really the work of archivists, and I think that the book, as a result, helps more people engage with the ideas in the longer term. So I think there's opportunities for really thinking about when might a different platform in a different format work, and might it be doing something different than what you try to do as a humanities scholar, to talk with your colleagues and to engage with the kind of historiography points that you had raised.
Yeah, I think it was a debate, as to whether a book would make sense. I mean, and it's a fragmented object. I mean, let's say it has a lot of different genres in it, and sometimes there's little methodology close-ups, sometimes there's like snapshots of visualizations. There's this thing that pulls you out through the QR codes. They are dynamic QR codes, so potentially one can update them in that regard. But there's also something about long-form argumentation that I thought was important. That is that we wanted to ground it in archival historical work, and I wanted to really engage with some of the critical issues around ethics and algorithms in an argument, and in the way that I think humanists do. And so the book form made sense, although we explored actually a scalar publication at one point, and we also explored, I think, some other kind of short form. Yeah, the book ended up being kind of long, but it also, I'd say, is a testament, I think, you said, to kind of a series of experiments that are processual and iterative in some ways. I don't think it's a grand synthesis. And I guess that was the other thing I had to say, that you mentioned, could everything be brought together and as a kind of grand synthesis? And I have to say that I was more interested in keeping it fragmentary on purpose. And so it's a lot of fragments that I think make sense together, but it's not there's no Hegelian moment in the book. It's only about particularity. And I should also say, I think there's copies if you're interested in buying one, but I put it on e-scholarship because I thought, it would be nice if people just could have it. And so you don't have to buy it. As much as I like, if you want to have a copy, it's on e-scholarship and you can get it for free. And so, yeah, that's that. I mean, thank you so much for these questions. This was really great. I think we can just have a more informal conversation.
Yeah. That's great. We should say thank you to these, but there's cookies and things at the back. We can have more informal conversation, come and have some, but thank you so much to those three.